summer. As we get started tonight, I wanted to show you a picture. I think that you're going to find this kind of interesting. The words on this flag here, it's a painting. The words on this flag here say, Cerca trova, if you can see that. Cerca trova is an Italian phrase that means seek and find. Now what I'm showing you here is a close-up of a tiny detail that's a part of an enormous painting that covers a whole wall in an old judicial building in Florence, Italy called the Palazzo Vecchio, the old palace. This particular painting is by a guy named Giorgio Vasari. Now to give you some context, this close-up here of this flag here that says Cerca trova is actually really only about that big in the span of this, in comparison to this whole enormous painting, this enormous mural. In other words, you would have to know where you were looking, and you would have to be looking pretty closely if you were going to see this tiny detail on this huge painting. Cerca trova, seek and find. I show you this because in 2005, this tiny detail on this huge painting began to cause quite a stir. In fact, this little flag that says Cerca trova is now at the center of a real-life treasure hunt in search for a lost Leonardo da Vinci painting. Like, if you've ever seen the movie National Treasure, it's kind of like that, except more real and less Nicolas Cage. And so here's the story that goes with it. In 1505, Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned to paint a mural in the Palazzo Vecchio called the Battle of Anghiari. That's the lost painting that people don't know what happened to it. We know that he painted it because we have some of his early sketches and his preparatory notes and his plans to do this painting. We also have records of him working on a project on this very wall of the Palazzo Vecchio. And we even have some other artists' copies of his mural, the Battle of Anghiari, like this one here by Peter Paul Rubens. So I say all that to say that we know the painting existed, at least in part, at one point in time. But the thing is, from everything we can tell, Leonardo da Vinci never finished his painting. In fact, he died in 1519 before he had ever finished this huge project on the wall of this palace building. And so then, about 40 years later, there was a new leader, a new duke who rose to power in Florence, and he comes into the Palazzo Vecchio and he decides to redo this whole room. And so he looks and he sees the unfinished works on the wall, and he commissions another artist named Giorgio Vasari to paint something there instead and to get rid of what was on the wall before, to start fresh, you could say. And so it's long been believed that the unfinished Leonardo da Vinci painting, the Battle of Anghiari, was destroyed, and then it was replaced by this Giorgio Vasari painting that we see today. That's what everybody has believed until recently, when this guy named Maurizio Saracini, that's a pretty cool name, noticed that this tiny flag on the painting says Cerca trova, and he had a wild idea. What if the famous lost Leonardo painting wasn't destroyed after all? What if this little detail on this Vasari painting is actually telling us to seek and find this painting? So for the past several years, that's exactly what he's been trying to do. He's been searching to find the long-lost Leonardo da Vinci painting, which he believes is actually right there beneath the newer Giorgio Vasari painting that's there today. Of course, the problem is you can't just tear through the painting that's there because it's a masterpiece in its own right. And so you have a problem here. You've got to find a way to see what lies beneath this masterpiece painting, to see if there's something there, without doing injustice or harm to the painting that lies in front of it, the one that we see today. And that's not an easy task. Nevertheless, Maurizio Saracini believes that if you could do that, if you could get at what's behind this painting, not only would you find a lost masterpiece behind it, but you would also deepen the meaning and the beauty and the significance of this painting that now covers it, the one that came later, the one that invites you ever so subtly to seek and find. Now, I tell you that story tonight because I think that it's kind of in the spirit of what we're going to be hoping to do these next few Wednesday nights. As you know, on Sunday mornings, we've just started studying the Exodus story in the Old Testament. We started that last Sunday. And so tonight, as we start a new series on Wednesday night, I want to do something that's related to that. I want us to take these next couple weeks and take a closer look at some of our most important core Christian practices that come from the New Testament. I'm thinking here of baptism and the Lord's Supper. And I want to take and look at these practices that we have more closely and see how they connect to the story of the Exodus that we're studying on Sundays. In other words, we're going to be looking at the portrait of baptism and communion that we see in the New Testament, which is a masterpiece in its own right. But we're also going to be looking at what lies behind that portrait as well, or trying to. We're going to be looking to the Exodus story. We're going to be reading some stories there about water and bread, about salvation and God's covenant to us. And I think that what we'll see is that these stories help us to understand the significance of why we do what we do today as believers in Jesus. So I'm calling this series we're doing Bread and Water, Exodus Roots for Christian Practices. And we're going to be looking for the masterpiece behind the masterpiece of God's redemption story, in hopes that we might not do any harm to the story of Christ, but instead be able to see it as even more beautiful and even more significant to us. So that's the plan, and that's kind of the motivation that we have for it. But still, I don't know, maybe you might be thinking, what's the point? I mean, we all know what the New Testament says in its own right about baptism and the Lord's Supper, and it paints a pretty full picture of the significance and how essential and important those things are. So why do we need to look anywhere else? And also, I'm sure there's a lot of us here tonight who already have been baptized, and a lot of us here tonight who take the Lord's Supper every week. So don't we kind of have all of this down already? Well, in a sense, that may be kind of true. The New Testament does offer us a full and beautiful, convincing picture for why we should care about these things, baptism and the Lord's Supper. It's a masterpiece in its own right. But if you read the New Testament closely, I think that what we'll see is that the New Testament itself invites us to look back. It invites us to go back and look deeply at the story that came before it. It challenges us to see the connection between these Christian practices we have now and the story of Israel in the Old Testament. For example, in the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians, they reveal to us that even the earliest Christians believed that their practices of baptism and taking communion together were a continuation of Israel's story. They viewed it as the fullness of what God had started so many years before. Consider what Paul says in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, where Paul writes this: I don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud. He's talking about the Exodus story. Israel following the cloud, and all passed through the sea, passing through the Red Sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So here what Paul is writing to Christians, he's writing to mostly actually Gentile Christians. And for some of these Christians in the church in Corinth, they're having questions and concerns and struggles with the way that they've been taking and sharing the Lord's Supper together. And for others of the Christians in Corinth, there's this issue with letting idolatry sneak back into their worship. And so to those questions and problems, what does Paul do? He takes and he draws on the story of the Exodus to explain the importance of these things that we do together, baptism and the Lord's Supper. In other words, Paul basically says that just as Israel was saved and set free by passing through the sea to freedom, and just as they were sustained and fed by the spiritual food and the spiritual drink in the wilderness, so also we are set free and saved and sustained by Jesus. And our experience is like their experience when we pass through the waters, when we share in the meal. Another example is in Romans, when Paul is talking about the importance of baptism. And basically what he says about it is that baptism is what sets us free from the slavery of sin and death. Thanks be to God, Paul writes, that you, having once been slaves of sin, have become obedient from the heart, and that you, having been set free from sin, have become slaves to righteousness. Now I think when I read that Paul is likely thinking about the Exodus story here. Because as we shall see in this story, Israel is taken from slavery to freedom, but not just that. After Israel is freed from their slavery to Egypt, they choose voluntarily to be servants of God. So in other words, they go from being serving Pharaoh in Egypt, which is this harsh, heartless ruler, to serving the one true God, who is this benevolent and good ruler. It's the same transition that Paul's describing here when he talks about being a slave of sin, but then turning now and being a slave to righteousness, where freedom abounds. That's Israel's story that we're talking about here. And Paul is saying essentially that the story of Christ continues now. It continues from there, and it continues in you. Does that make sense? So I guess what I'm saying is that these New Testament texts, 1 Corinthians 10, Romans 6, and others, they are for us a way of seeing how the story of Israel and the story of Christ are connected. They matter to one another. And these texts for us are almost like little flags that say Cerca Trova. They're flags that invite us to go back and to seek and find and to go deep into the old stories and find the significance that they have for understanding the new, for understanding what we do in these practices of our faith. So that's what I hope that we're going to find as we do this together, as we turn to Exodus. And here's a little preview of what I think we have coming. In Exodus, we see how God uses water to rescue his people. It starts with Moses in the basket in the Nile River. You remember that story when he's a baby and he's set on the river. And then it culminates with the point when Israel passes through the Red Sea from slavery into freedom. God rescues his people, and he sets them free from the enslaving power of Pharaoh. And it's not just that he saves them either, but in the process of doing all of this, it's as if he's created a new people. Because the people that pass through the waters will never be the same again. They have been given a new life. They've been given a new purpose. They'll never be the same. Likewise, we also see stories of how God uses bread to provide for the very basic needs of his people as they're in the wilderness, to sustain them when they have nothing else to sustain them. God provides bread from heaven, Exodus 16 tells us, as they journey toward their new home. And then later on, there's this beautiful moment at the mountain of God when the covenant of God is sealed with the blood of the covenant and the breaking of bread together, communing with God and sharing in this meal in the presence of God. God makes his covenant, his promise, last for his people. So you can see how God uses even simple things like water and bread to communicate to his people, to communicate his grace and his presence and his faithfulness. And you can see how even still today, we see how God does the same for you and me. There's another reason that I want to do this study with you and do this together, and I think it's a fairly practical one. And that is, as Christians, and especially as people who claim the churches of Christ, we're people who have emphasized very strongly the importance of baptism and of the Lord's Supper. And I'm so thankful for that. And I believe deeply in that because there's so much to this here. There's so much meaning in it, so much significance of it for our lives in these practices. And that's exactly the reason why we need to continue to come back to them again and again and continue to search the Scriptures to understand them more and more and better. Because the last thing that we want to do is to reduce the importance of these practices into something shorter, something less than they truly are. We want to get all of it. We want to be able to share and express all of it to others. Not because God needs us to understand things perfectly in order for His work of grace to happen for us, but because the more we understand and the more we believe in the way God works through these things, the better we'll understand Him and His love for us. And the better we'll be able to share that message with others more fully and more richly. So that's the task that we're kind of working toward here. And it's a tall task. It's a lot to ask to understand the fullness of these beautiful gifts that God has given us in baptism and in the Lord's Supper. But as we look to the story of the Exodus together, I hope that we'll be able to start to understand it even more deeply than before. And I pray that God is going to bless us on our journey to do just that. I want to come back to our story that we began with. I want to tell you the rest of it. Truth is, nobody's quite sure what happened to this lost painting, this lost Leonardo painting, and whether it really is behind this Vasari painting in Italy, we don't know exactly or not. Now, the guy I introduced you to before, Maurizio Saraceni, he's not given up on it. In fact, one of his recent findings is interesting. He found that when Vasari painted the newer painting there, he didn't just do it on the original wall that was there, but he constructed a new brick wall in front of it. And he found that there's, using like laser mapping techniques and infrared, he found that there's actually a space between the two walls, and that space is directly behind the flag that says Cercatrova. Now, the city of Florence allowed him to drill a tiny hole in this painting and drill through and see if he could get some paint from the wall behind it. And he did. And what he found was a very similar paint to what's on the Mona Lisa, which Leonardo painted while he was living in Florence. So all of these things are interesting, but they don't prove anything. And now he waits, because in order to do what he needs to do next, it takes this really expensive equipment that he doesn't have funding for, or it takes just cutting a hole in the painting that's in front of it, and they don't want him to do that either. And so he waits, and all he can do is wonder and guess and wait and hope that maybe there's something behind it, but you'll never know for sure. Thankfully, our search in Christ is far more optimistic than that. Thankfully, we have a God who, even though He is far, far above us in every way, we have a God who wants us to know Him. We have a God who wanted to reveal Himself to us. He wanted to communicate with us, for us to know Him and to come to love Him and to recognize His voice and to feel the love that He has for us as well. Thankfully, we have a God who gave us a story, that happened in real history, a story that tells us about Him and His care for us and His covenant to us. Thankfully, we have a God who gave us the gifts of baptism and communion that we share together, through which He communicates to us still. He communicates His assurance. He communicates His salvation. He communicates His presence. He communicates His grace to us through these gifts that He's given us. He gives us a chance to participate in the old story, to participate in the story of Christ, and even back further than that, to participate in the story of Israel, because He wants us to know Him. Thankfully, we have a God who wanted us so deeply to know Him and to be known by Him that He wrapped up the divine mystery in human flesh. He became a human in everything that that means in Jesus because He wanted us to know Him with more than just feeble guesses and hunches. The Word became flesh, the Gospel says, because He lived among us. He revealed Himself to us. Thankfully, we have a God who says to us, "Seek and you will find," and He really means it. And so we seek Him with all of our hearts, knowing that He wants to be known by us. In His Word and in His Son, and through the life of the church, He reveals Himself to us. We have a lot to be thankful for in that. And I guess the challenge that I have for you tonight, I know most of what I've said tonight has been kind of introductory to what we're going to be doing these next few weeks. But the challenge I have for you tonight is to never stop seeking Him, to never stop seeking to know Him more fully and to follow Him more closely and to be like Him more completely. Now, I realize that for many of you, you've been seeking God a lot longer than I have. For some of you, a lot longer than I have. But all the same, we've got to be a people who hunger and thirst for righteousness. We've got to be a people who live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, as Jesus says in Matthew. Because He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus. Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, Paul writes. In Christ, the wisdom of God and the salvation of God is made known to us because He wanted us to know it, because He wanted us to experience it. And so we seek Him with everything that we have, that we might know it more deeply. Tonight I will offer an invitation as we often do when we gather together. This is just a moment for us as we consider what God has done for us to look at our own hearts. And no matter where we are in our standing with God, however long we've been seeking Him, we can all look closely in our own hearts and ask how we can be more like Him and seek Him more fully. And so maybe tonight, by the grace of God, you're touched by the fact that God Himself wanted to know you, and He wanted you to know Him, and you want to seek Him more fully. That's part of our invitation tonight. And maybe there's somebody here tonight who's ready to